In the past century, humanity has mastered the art of making noise. Literal noise, digital noise, and the endless chatter of our own minds. We have created technologies that amplify our voices to the farthest corners of the planet. Yet we are often deaf to the quiet truths around us. As we step into 2026, I invite you to consider a paradox that sometimes the most radical act is not to speak, but to be silent. Silence is not emptiness. It is the space where clarity emerges, where reflection grows, and where we reconnect with the fundamental rhythms of life. Today, I want to explore why choosing silence in a world addicted to sound might be the key to understanding ourselves, our relationships, and the society we are shaping. In 2026, the act of silence is no longer a passive choice, it is a deliberate strategy, a conscious resistance against the relentless torrent of sound, images, and data that has come to define modern existence. Human beings, since the dawn of history, have sought meaning through expression, through words, through the constant articulation of thoughts, desires, and fears. Yet, paradoxically, the louder our voices become, the less capable we are of hearing the subtle currents beneath the surface of reality. The human mind, a remarkable instrument for prediction, imagination, and narrative, thrives in dialogue, yet suffers in unceasing monologue. To be silent is to create a vacuum within which clarity can arise. It is not a retreat from the world, but an engagement with its deeper layers. When we speak incessantly, we inhabit a world of appearances, of transient reflections and superficial certainties. Silence, in contrast, allows us to inhabit a world of truths that exist regardless of whether they are articulated or observed. In 2026, the challenge is not merely external noise, but the internal noise. The constant mental chatter that distracts, confuses, and shapes our perceptions without our consent. The human brain has been conditioned by centuries of narrative and expectation to resist stillness, yet in this resistance lies the very essence of growth. Consider the structure of modern life. Cities vibrate with unending activity. Digital platforms amplify every opinion, every impulse, every emotional reaction. Social media, designed to connect, often ensnares, leaving individuals in a state of perpetual response. Notifications demand attention. Algorithms exploit curiosity, and human attention becomes a currency traded for fleeting satisfaction. In this environment, silence is revolutionary. It is a declaration that one's consciousness will not be endlessly exploited, that one's mind is not a commodity for constant consumption. Silence is not absence, but presence. It is the art of turning inward without disengaging from the world. In the quiet, we become capable of observing patterns, understanding causality, and discerning the subtle influences that shape our decisions. The value of silence lies in its capacity to produce insight, to sharpen perception, and to cultivate patience. The human capacity for reflection is intimately tied to the experience of silence. Cognitive science has shown that moments of introspection, often facilitated by solitude and quiet, enable the brain to reorganize information, solve problems, and integrate experiences into coherent narratives. Yet in modern society, reflection is systematically eroded. Continuous engagement, both physical and virtual, fragments attention and interrupts deep thought. The consequences are profound. Individuals find themselves reacting impulsively, making decisions shaped by momentary stimuli rather than long-term understanding. In this context, silence is not an indulgence, it is an evolutionary necessity. By intentionally withdrawing from noise, the mind enters a state of heightened awareness, capable of perceiving connections and patterns invisible to the perpetually distracted. History provides countless examples of the transformative power of silence. Philosophers, scientists, and leaders throughout time have recognized that insight often emerges not in the act of speaking, but in the careful observation of what exists between words. The ancients practiced contemplative silence, recognizing that wisdom is often expressed not through language, but through the ability to witness without interference. In modern times, this principle is equally relevant, though increasingly threatened by the velocity of information. The human nervous system, designed for intermittent alertness, now functions in a state of constant arousal. Silence serves as a reset, a recalibration of the mind and body to rhythms that predate technological acceleration. In the absence of quiet, individuals risk becoming reactive agents of stimuli rather than intentional participants in life. Silence is, therefore, both a refuge and a training ground, cultivating the capacity to respond with discernment rather than reflex. The benefits of silence extend beyond individual cognition. Human relationships, paradoxically, are often deepened not by words, but by the ability to share space without immediate articulation. In silence, empathy can arise. In the absence of imposed interpretation, one can perceive the emotional currents of others more fully. Communication, in this sense, is not merely a function of expression, but of attention. By cultivating silence, individuals learn the rare skill of listening, not to reply, but to understand. In 2026, when social interaction is mediated through digital platforms and curated content, this capacity becomes increasingly valuable. Listening without interruption, without immediate judgment, without preemptive framing, is an act of profound resistance against the homogenization of thought. Moreover, silence allows for a recalibration of values. The modern world often imposes priorities dictated by visibility, popularity, or immediate impact. Yet the most consequential decisions, the ones that shape societies and civilizations, are rarely the result of loud declarations. They emerge from careful observation, deliberate thought, and the capacity to wait until understanding matures. Silence fosters patience, a quality that enables individuals to distinguish between superficial urgencies and enduring truth. It also fosters resilience. In a culture addicted to feedback and validation, the capacity to remain silent, to act without seeking external reinforcement, cultivates a form of independence increasingly rare and increasingly precious. Silence also serves as a mirror to the self. In the absence of constant distraction, individuals encounter their own thoughts, fears, and desires unmediated by external influence. This confrontation can be uncomfortable, yet it is essential for growth. By resisting the impulse to speak or act immediately, one cultivates a capacity to observe one's own motivations objectively. Inner silence is not a void. It is a space in which awareness expands and understanding deepens. It allows for the disentangling of transient impulses from enduring values, of instinctual reactions from considered judgments. In a world dominated by the tyranny of immediacy, such a capacity is both rare and revolutionary. Furthermore, silence has a temporal dimension. It allows individuals to inhabit the present fully, rather than being carried perpetually toward the next stimulus, the next message, the next obligation. In silence, time itself is perceived differently, moments expand, and the significance of experience is revealed in ways impossible amid the rush of activity. In 2026, when technology accelerates perception and compresses experience, reclaiming temporal depth through silence is an act of profound agency. One begins to notice the subtle patterns of life, the interconnections of events, and the delicate interplay of cause and consequence. Silence is, in this sense, both observational and creative. It allows the mind to simulate possibilities, to imagine futures, and to evaluate choices without interference. Finally, silence fosters a recognition of interdependence. In quiet observation, the individual begins to perceive the complex networks that sustain life, from ecological systems to social structures, from personal relationships to global dynamics. Noise obscures these networks, presenting the world as a series of disconnected events. Silence reveals their continuity and interrelation, allowing for decisions informed by understanding rather than impulse. It cultivates humility, as one becomes aware of the scale and complexity of forces beyond individual control. It cultivates wisdom, as one learns to act with awareness of consequences rather than from immediate desire. To practice silence in 2026 is therefore not a withdrawal from the world, but a strategic engagement with it. It is an act of resistance against distraction, a cultivation of discernment, and a reclamation of temporal and cognitive space. Silence is a tool, a lens, and a discipline, a way to reclaim agency in an era defined by perpetual stimulus. Those who master it gain not only clarity of thought, but also depth of perception, resilience of character, and a capacity for understanding that transcends the superficialities of modern existence. In silence, the mind becomes a clear instrument. In silence, the heart becomes attentive. In silence, life reveals dimensions that noise alone cannot convey. In the landscape of modern existence, the impulse to react is relentless. Every moment is saturated with stimuli demanding immediate attention. Emails, messages, notifications, opinions, events, and the human brain, conditioned for rapid response, often obeys reflexively rather than intentionally. The consequence is a society in which actions are increasingly divorced from reflection, in which decisions are driven by reaction rather than deliberation, and in which individuals are caught in a perpetual cycle of external influence. To listen to the self before reacting is, in 2026, both a radical act and a necessary one. It requires cultivating the capacity to pause, to observe the impulses arising within, and to distinguish between those that are fleeting and those that carry enduring significance. This process is not instinctual, it is cultivated through practice, through discipline, and through the conscious creation of spaces in which the self can be heard without interruption. The human mind is remarkably adept at producing narratives from the earliest moments of consciousness. Individuals construct stories to explain events, anticipate outcomes, and navigate social interactions. These narratives are often compelling, urgent, and emotionally charged, yet they are not always accurate reflections of reality. When stimuli are abundant and constant, the mind is more likely to react according to habitual patterns, conditioned by fear, desire, or expectation. In such moments, listening to the self becomes an act of disentanglement, separating the reflexive response from the considered judgment, the ephemeral emotion from the enduring value. In 2026, this capacity is critical, for the velocity of information has accelerated the reflexive mind to unprecedented speed, and the consequences of reaction without reflection can be profound, both personally and collectively. To listen to the self requires cultivating awareness of one's internal landscape. It demands attention to thought, emotion, and bodily sensation, not as distractions to be suppressed, but as signals to be interpreted. Modern neuroscience reveals that the brain integrates multiple streams of information simultaneously, often unconsciously, producing judgments and impulses before conscious awareness registers them. By practicing the art of listening to the self, individuals learn to access the gap between stimulus and response, a gap in which freedom resides. This gap is where reflection occurs, where choice is exercised, and where the possibility of intentional action emerges. Silence, in this sense, is the medium through which the self can be heard clearly amidst the clamorous world. It is the space in which the mind ceases to chase every impulse and begins to discern which impulses merit attention and which can be set aside. Historically, thinkers and leaders have understood the power of pausing before action. Philosophers from various traditions emphasize the cultivation of inner awareness as a prerequisite for wise conduct. In contemplative practices, the pause before reaction is central. One observes desire without acting, witnesses anger without giving it expression, and discerns fear without allowing it to dictate behavior. These practices, developed over centuries, highlight a principle that modern life often obscures. The capacity to act effectively emerges from the capacity to listen deeply to oneself. When individuals are dominated by reflexive reaction, they are at the mercy of circumstance and emotion. When they cultivate the habit of listening first, they regain sovereignty over their choices, transforming each moment of potential impulse into an opportunity for deliberate engagement. Listening to the self is also intimately connected to understanding the nature of influence. In contemporary society, influence is pervasive, subtle, and often imperceptible. Media, social networks, and interpersonal pressures shape perceptions, beliefs, and behaviors in ways that are often unconscious. Without an internal point of reference, individuals become conduits for external forces, their reactions reflecting the priorities of others rather than their own considered judgment. Silence provides the foundation for resistance to such influence. By pausing and listening inwardly, one can evaluate external information critically, distinguish between signal and noise, and respond in alignment with personal values rather than external coercion. In 2026, when the speed of communication outpaces the capacity for reflection, this skill is essential for maintaining integrity, clarity, and agency. The act of listening to the self is not a solitary endeavor confined to introspection. It has profound implications for relationships and social interaction. Individuals who cultivate this skill are better able to respond empathetically, to perceive the needs and emotions of others without distortion, and to act in ways that are informed rather than reactive. By observing one's own internal processes, one gains insight into the universality of certain human experiences, the dynamics of fear, desire, attachment, and resistance. This awareness fosters patience, tolerance, and a capacity for thoughtful engagement in social contexts. The individual who listens before reacting becomes a stabilizing presence, capable of contributing to dialogue without being consumed by it, capable of offering perspective without imposing it. Moreover, listening to the self enhances the capacity for ethical discernment. Decisions made in haste, under the pressure of immediate stimulus, often prioritize expedience over principle. Reflection allows the individual to consider consequences, weigh alternatives, and align actions with deeper values. In a world increasingly dominated by rapid decision-making and short-term outcomes, this capacity is essential. Ethical clarity arises not from ideology alone, but from the ability to pause, to consider the implications of choice, and to act in accordance with a coherent moral framework. Silence, once again, is the medium that makes such clarity possible, providing the internal environment in which thought and conscience can operate without interference. The process of listening to the self also intersects with creativity and problem-solving. Innovation often emerges not from immediate reaction, but from the incubation of ideas, the unconscious processing of information, and the integration of diverse perspectives. By allowing oneself to step back, to observe internal responses without acting on them immediately, the mind enters a state conducive to insight. Solutions that are overlooked in the rush of reflexive activity may become apparent when attention is cultivated and observation prioritized. In 2026, when technological systems accelerate the pace of life and amplify the pressure to act without delay, the deliberate cultivation of this pause becomes a form of strategic advantage. Culturally, the ability to listen to the self before reacting is increasingly countercultural. Modern narratives celebrate immediacy, impulsivity, and constant engagement, yet the history of human thought demonstrates that the capacity for considered response is a hallmark of wisdom. Societies that prioritize reflection, contemplation, and deliberate action often produce individuals capable of leadership, innovation, and ethical judgment. Conversely, societies dominated by reflexive behavior risk instability, conflict, and the erosion of trust. In this sense, the act of listening to the self is both a personal and a collective imperative. It shapes not only the individual, but also the broader social fabric. Furthermore, listening inwardly cultivates resilience in the face of uncertainty. The modern world presents challenges of immense scale: environmental crises, political volatility, technological disruption, and social complexity. Reacting impulsively to each stimulus can lead to exhaustion, confusion, and error. By creating an internal space in which the self can be heard, individuals develop the capacity to evaluate situations calmly, to anticipate consequences, and to respond strategically. This resilience is not passive. It is the product of conscious engagement with one's own thought processes, of cultivating an awareness that precedes action, rather than following it. Practically, the practice of listening to the self can take many forms: meditation, reflective journaling, intentional pauses before decisions, and disciplined periods of solitude. These practices are not escapes from reality, but training grounds for engagement. They teach the individual to discern patterns, to observe the interplay of emotion and cognition, and to act from a place of understanding rather than impulse. In 2026, these practices are more than personal enrichment. They are essential tools for navigating a complex, fast-moving, and often overwhelming world. Ultimately, to listen to the self before reacting is to reclaim agency in a world designed to provoke response. It is to acknowledge that each individual possesses the capacity for discernment, reflection, and intentional action. It is to understand that freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the presence of choice. In cultivating this ability, individuals can transform their engagement with life from one of reactive participation to one of deliberate creation. Silence and reflection provide the foundation. Action informed by this foundation becomes purposeful, ethical, and wise. In 2026, the world presents itself at an unprecedented pace. An ever-shifting tableau of events, opinions, conflicts, and information. Each day, individuals are confronted with a barrage of stimuli demanding evaluation, categorization, and response. In such an environment, the human instinct is to judge rapidly, to classify, to approve or condemn, to take sides before sufficient understanding has emerged. Yet judgment, when immediate and unexamined, is often misleading. It is colored by bias, shaped by limited perception, and distorted by the compulsion to act or respond. Observing the world without immediate judgment is therefore an essential practice, one that allows clarity to emerge from the chaos and depth to arise from complexity. This practice is not a denial of discernment, nor a suspension of ethics or values. It is rather a method for aligning perception with reality, for seeing the world in its full richness before imposing the structures of interpretation upon it. Human perception is inherently selective. From the earliest stages of evolution, the brain has been trained to detect patterns, to assess threats, and to prioritize immediate action. These mechanisms, crucial for survival in a world of predators and scarce resources, remain embedded in our neurological architecture. Yet in the modern world, these reflexes often produce distorted judgments. A headline triggers outrage before facts are verified. An image evokes emotion before context is considered. A conversation provokes reaction before listening has occurred. The mind, primed for rapid evaluation, often substitutes instinct for insight. Observing without immediate judgment is an exercise in retraining perception, in cultivating patience, and in resisting the compulsion to collapse complexity into simplistic binaries. It is a practice that allows the richness of reality to be apprehended fully before interpretation, evaluation, or action. The benefits of delayed judgment are manifold. Psychologically, it fosters equanimity. When the mind ceases to leap to conclusions, emotional volatility diminishes. The human tendency to polarize, good versus bad, right versus wrong, friend versus enemy, is tempered. Awareness expands, allowing nuance, contradiction, and ambiguity to coexist without immediate resolution. In 2026, this capacity is critical, as global interconnectedness exposes individuals to diverse perspectives, conflicting narratives, and unfamiliar social, political, and cultural contexts. The reflexive imposition of judgment often leads to misunderstanding, miscommunication, and conflict. Observing first, withholding judgment, cultivates the capacity to comprehend before responding, to listen before condemning, and to engage before reacting. Historical examples abound of the power of observation prior to judgment. Great leaders, thinkers, and innovators often distinguished themselves not by the speed of their conclusions, but by the quality of their attention. They observed carefully, sought context, and allowed understanding to emerge over time. In contrast, hasty judgment frequently precipitates error, alienation, and unintended consequences. Modern society, with its obsession with speed and immediacy, has inverted this principle. Opinion is valued over understanding, reaction over reflection, visibility over comprehension. Observing without judgment is a deliberate reclaiming of the cognitive space necessary for wisdom. It is an acknowledgement that understanding requires time, attention, and the suspension of immediate bias. The process of observing without judgment begins with awareness of internal tendencies. The human mind is rarely neutral. Perceptions are filtered through personal beliefs, experiences, and emotions. To observe the world clearly, one must first observe oneself, to recognize the impulses, biases, and preconceptions that shape perception. This self-awareness is the foundation for impartial observation. Without it, one risks projecting internal narratives onto external events, mistaking interpretation for reality. By cultivating mindfulness, reflection, and attention to thought processes, individuals learn to distinguish between the content of perception and the coloring imposed by judgment. Observing without judgment also enhances the capacity for learning. Education, in its most profound sense, is not the accumulation of facts, but the refinement of perception. When immediate judgment is suspended, the mind becomes receptive to complexity, contradiction, and nuance. It can absorb diverse perspectives, integrate new information, and reassess prior assumptions. In 2026, when knowledge is abundant but often fragmented, the ability to observe without imposing preconceptions is crucial. It allows the individual to navigate complexity, discern patterns, and develop insights that are inaccessible to those who react reflexively. Socially, observing without immediate judgment fosters empathy. When judgment is withheld, the mind is free to consider the experiences, motivations, and circumstances of others. Conflict diminishes, dialogue deepens, and relationships are strengthened. Empathy, in this sense, is not simply an emotional response, but a cognitive skill cultivated through disciplined observation. By resisting the impulse to categorize, criticize, or condemn, One creates space for understanding, for connection, and for ethical action informed by context rather than prejudice. Cognitive science provides insight into why immediate judgment is so compelling and why its suspension is challenging. The human brain seeks closure. It favors certainty over ambiguity. Immediate evaluation provides a sense of control and predictability, reducing anxiety and cognitive load. Yet this mechanism, while adaptive in certain contexts, distorts perception in complex and rapidly changing environments. Observing without judgment requires the deliberate activation of attentional systems that tolerate ambiguity, process complexity, and defer closure. It is a cognitive discipline that counteracts instinctual shortcuts, fostering deliberate, reflective engagement with reality. The practice of observation without immediate judgment also intersects with ethical discernment. Many moral failures arise not from malice, but from hastiness, decisions made before adequate understanding, judgments formed before sufficient evidence, actions taken without appreciating context. By observing first, individuals create the conditions for morally informed action. They learn to distinguish between superficial appearances and deeper realities, between transient impulses and enduring principles. In 2026, when ethical dilemmas are increasingly complex and multifaceted, the capacity to observe carefully before judging is both a personal and societal imperative. Furthermore, observing without judgment cultivates resilience. In a world characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, reactive judgment often produces stress, conflict, and error. By contrast, disciplined observation allows individuals to navigate uncertainty with composure, to respond with adaptability, and to act with foresight. It transforms the experience of unpredictability from a source of anxiety into an opportunity for insight, reflection, and strategic engagement. The cultivation of this practice requires deliberate strategies. Techniques such as mindfulness meditation, reflective journaling, and structured observation exercises train the mind to resist immediate evaluation. These practices are not intended to paralyze action or suppress judgment entirely, but to create a temporal buffer in which understanding can develop. They teach the individual to notice thought and emotion, to recognize impulses, and to allow perception to mature before forming conclusions. In doing so, they transform observation into a skill of deliberate engagement rather than a passive or reactive